miracle of organizational prowess, which they don't seem to have. Al-Qaeda was able to kill 20,000 people in an American city. Then I might think, you know, that was not such an inflated fear. But at the moment, looking back on the last decade, David Kilcullen, the counterterror and counterinsurgency expert, said the real problem was not the anarchists themselves in the late 19th and early 20th century and the number of people they could kill, which was in the several thousands. It was the reaction that they were going to produce, which ended up being World War I. And I think it's a reasonable narrative of the last 10 years that that has been Al-Qaeda's greatest success, is the reaction it's elicited. Back to Iran for 1 second. I think the key question is, what is the nature of that regime? Is it basically the Soviet Union? Or is it something closer to Hezbollah? Ray Taki, who was one of the hidden policy guys on Iran until he left Dennis Ross's office in the first year, recently wrote a piece saying basically it's closer to the latter. And Ray Taki was an engagement guy. I mean, he was a strong force for engagement. So he's saying they're basically driven by millenarian, apocalyptic ideologies that are not entirely self-preserving, that could lead to self-destruction. There's others who argue that this is basically a regime that wants to survive in power. And the last 30 years have shown that that's what essentially motivates it, including the willingness to turn guns on its own people. In fact, to do more than that. So the question of policy toward Iran comes down to the question of the nature of the regime, I think. And I don't know the answer. I don't think the White House knows the answer, because our information about it is pretty bad. That's a big problem. For 30 years, we've been in darkness on Iran.
And indeed, you could say, and people do. Thanasis Kambanis' very interesting new book on Hezbollah seems to argue that Hezbollah is not just a millenarian, apocalyptic group either, or not just.
Right.
But is very savvy politically, very well organized, property-owning, income distributing political party in Lebanon.
With a social service infrastructure,
no
et cetera,
question
et cetera. Yeah.
about it. Before I go on with that, just one thing on the Christmas polling, because I think you're right, the administration tried to laugh it off. When you look at it, and if, like me, you have a lot of friends coming from Europe who are put through increasing humiliation just to come and say, teach a course at this university or in this town, all the time, here's a guy, a Nigerian, who's just been banned from Britain by the government for terrorist associations, some weeks before, whose father has gone to the American embassy in Nigeria, in Lagos, to say, I think my son's gone rogue somewhere in Yemen. It's probably this Solauki guy who you keep on about, who weeks before had done this, who nonetheless manages to board a flight to the United States, paying in cash for a one-way ticket, and without being searched. I think that is very serious. What you need is for that to happen, to be found to have happened with the next person who manages to kill a lot of people.
Right.
And then there will be anger, and I will be part of it. And I won't take any Department of Homeland Security secretary, whatever her name is, saying he was just proving the system worked. Not even if it's Boxing Day, I'm not going to do that. So, now I think I was at a Hezbollah rally not long ago in southern Beirut. I don't recommend it as a recreational experience, but it does demonstrate a very, very impressive degree of organization. And I couldn't help noticing the new party symbol on the flag and on the banners is a nuclear mushroom cloud. Now, and when you look at it closer, the cloud is made out of Arabic characters. I suppose in Iran it would be made out of Persian characters, in this case Arabic, which carries a message to the infinitely despised Jewish people. I wouldn't want to look back later and think, maybe I should have seen that warning. I think one's entitled to take a thing like that seriously. I think, in fact, one's morally obliged to do so. And just as I think in negotiations with Hamas, for example, it's too much to ask for any party in the Middle East that they adopt a pacifist stand and give up forswear violence. But I don't think it's too much to ask Hamas to give up the protocols of the Elders of Zion as part of their party manifesto. I think that's something the UN can, and its Anti-Racism Commission, in fact, the meeting this week, can become seized of. That is a war-making racist incitement. It's banned by every document of the UN and has a very rank history. And just as we were within our rights to suggest to the PLO that it amended its charter some years ago, that's something that you can test. You can say, will you do that or won't you? Because if you won't, it must mean a lot to you, given what you could get by repudiating it. So I think it's a split decision on Iran. I think there are millenarian forces around Ahmadinejad in particular who do think that the hidden imam, the Mahdi, will come back in their lifetime and are making preparations for it. They don't say it would be the progress of his wonderful refulgent return would be advanced by a nuclear war, but they don't say it wouldn't either.
I mean,
but for the most part, I'm sure I know what they want the nukes for. Not to have a war with Israel either, because that would be the last thing they ever did, literally. Maybe down the road, but they don't want to immolate themselves. They run a very comfortable, very, very lucrative racket, mullahs. In Iran, I've seen it. They run everything from the brothels to the natural gas to the taxi drivers, and they don't want to give it up. What they do want is strategic ambiguity and the possibility of blackmail of their Sunni neighbors, in particular Bahrain, which is very noticeable now in the Iranian right-wing press. They've resumed the chant that Bahrain is really Iranian. It's their Kuwait. And one day they move into some neighboring Arab Sunni state with oil and say, well, we're in there, our troops are here, we have a nuclear weapon, what do you want to do about it?
So reading between the lines of what you're saying, to get back down to brass tacks, assuming that sanctions and diplomacy, if there is we ever even have any real diplomacy, get to a point where don't prove any more successful than they seem now, and Iran gets closer, and we surely would have the view that our military attack would be more successful than Israel's, then are you saying go for it at that point?
That it should be ourselves or Israel who should do it?
That at the end of the day, if we assume that, that sanctions are not going to work and that diplomacy is never going to get you anywhere, that at the end of the day, that Obama should do what Bush was unwilling to do, which was to take action, to take a military strike?
Well, since you asked me directly, at different times, each of us on this platform favored the overthrow of the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. And for different lengths of time, as I remember. But for quite similar reasons. As a sine qua non, there can't be any real, nothing can happen in Iraq while it remains the property of a psychopathic crime family. And that wasn't just a moral statement, it had other implications too. All of them, I think, by the way, correct. It didn't work out as well as any of us had hoped. It worked out much worse than any of us had feared. In analyzing this, because it does, like everything else, has to be subjected to an analysis, which of us wouldn't say that the job would have been better done in 1992? That the worst part of the Iraqi experience was the 10 years plus of Saddam plus sanctions, immiseration of the country, terrible suffering of the population, destruction of its internal infrastructure, all the things that make it nearly ungovernable now. Getting rid of Saddam would have been better done earlier, after he'd attempted, well, had in fact succeeded in abolishing a member state of the United Nations, correct, than afterwards. Well, certainly that's what I think. Well, I don't know how far the analogy could extend, but if there is going to be a confrontation with Iran, and I think there is going to be one because I think that's what they want, then I would...
They meaning the Iranians.
Sorry?
They meaning the Iranians.
With the Iranians, with the Iranian theocracy, with the Revolutionary Guard dictatorship within the dictatorship, and its nuclear covert wing, I think three. The time of that should be decided not by them. The pretext for it should be decided not by them. And it would be better done when they're not ready than when they are. That would be my strong view. It's a muted applause. Thank you, comrade.
It's a striking comment partly because, George, you know, the conventional wisdom in Washington is that the Israelis might or might not, but that America almost certainly won't, whether that's right or not. But the conventional wisdom is that there's no appetite for this inside the Obama administration. I wonder if you think that's right, and then also just to pose the same question to Christopher. Do you think the consequences of, let's take the worst case scenario, that none of these efforts short of war get you anywhere, that at the end of the day, military action is preferable to living with the Iranian nuclear bomb?
Well, first on Iraq, I have to say I never regretted the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. I regretted the consequences, especially the avoidable ones. And Iraq does raise some pretty tough questions for anyone proposing conflict with Iran. Whether it's in 92 or 2003, basically we don't know the consequences, but we do know that they will be to a large degree out of our control. That is the nature of war, and if I didn't know it before 2003, I certainly learned it on repeated trips to Iraq after 2003. We didn't know what the Iraqi people felt because they were in an absolutely sealed prison. It was almost impossible to gauge Iraqi public opinion. We knew what some exiles were saying, and some of them were rather persuasive, but we didn't know what the Iraqi... We have much more of a sense of what the Iranian public thinks about an American war in Iran, and it's basically overwhelmingly against it. And I think one reason is it would set back the democratic movement in Iran by decades. It would not overthrow the regime. We don't have it in our capacity to overthrow the regime. Only the Iranians can do that, and they wouldn't be able to do it because they're not in a position to. So politically, I think it would be an absolute disaster for the forces of democratic reform inside Iran, which are still there, even though they've been pretty badly beaten down and imprisoned and driven into exile. They're still there, and they remain the single most hopeful force in the Middle East. That is the one place where you can say the public is basically more pro-Western than the regime, wants democracy, maybe even liberal democracy. They've been driven by 30 years of theocracy to a position that's not that far from what everyone on this stage believes in. Do we want to take the chance that we're going to set that back by decades when, if left alone, it might have a chance, maybe not next year, but maybe in 5 years, of undermining the regime at home? So that's my top question. Anyone who's proposing war has to answer to the Iranians, especially to the young and very brave journalists and activists who are either in prison or in hiding or out of the country, but who, all those I've talked to, and I've talked to a lot of them, are unanimous against an American strike. So there are other strategic questions, especially having to do with the region, Sunni Arabs, and our own interests. I don't know that the Revolutionary Guard want a conflict or confrontation with the U.S. I think they want to walk up to that line, but not cross it. If they wanted a confrontation... The
line meaning the nuclear threshold, or the line meaning war?
War. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of things they could be doing right now, way beyond the cat and mouse game with the nuclear program, that they're not doing, because I actually think their own sense of their survival is the strongest motive. I might be wrong. I might be wrong, because as I said, we really don't know what goes on at the heart of that regime. But their behavior to me suggests they want to antagonize the U.S., they want to try to divide the world against the U.S. They certainly want to use Israel as to whip up the Arab street and turn Iran into the unlikely champion of Sunni Arabs. But I don't think they want a war.
So, Christopher, how do you answer that? That this could be if not the death, a grave setback to the Green Revolution that you care so much about?
Yes, and like George, I have a lot of friends in Iran and outside it now, alas, in the diaspora, who have a lot of the same misgivings. They're not as unanimous in saying that they're opposed to a strike, though, because for two reasons. One, a lot of them understand very plainly, and even some of the more moderate leaders of the Green movement have been heard to say it, those who lost the so-called election, for example, that they understand it's part of the reason for the isolation of their country, for its bankruptcy, its backwardness, the absence of cultural exchange and trade, and the preeminence of repression and thuggery is precisely the nuclear program. And they see that it's a feature, a very important feature of the dictatorship, especially of the Revolutionary Guards, who are their immediate oppressors. So much though they might like to separate it, they can't do it as easily as George just did. I mean, there it is. Second, let's put the case that we had absolutely smoking gun evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Suppose we had that. And we also knew that everyone in Iraq, including all the Kurds, was completely against the overthrow of Saddam Hussein.